Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us on this magnificently beautiful day to talk about some magnificently beautiful prints in the permanent collection. My name is Emily Beanie. I'm Chief Curator of the Legion of Honor, and today it's my honor and delight to introduce Dr. Natalia Lauricella, Curator of Prints and Drawings at the Achenbach Center for the Graphic Arts. Yes, indeed. This lecture is the fifth in a series called A Closer Look that we are organizing every second Saturday here at the Legion of Honor throughout this, our centennial year. So please do come back every second Saturday to hear from various curators about different areas of the collection housed at this museum and belonging to all San Franciscans. Before proceeding, I'm going to share our institutional land acknowledgement. The Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco occupy unceded land of the Ramaytush Ohlone, who are the original inhabitants of what is now the San Francisco Peninsula. The Greater Bay Area is also ancestral territory of other Ohlone peoples, as well as the Miwok, Yakuts, and Patwin. We acknowledge, recognize, and honor the indigenous ancestors, elders, and descendants whose nations and communities have lived in the Bay Area over many generations and continue to do so today. We respect the enduring relationships that exist between indigenous peoples and their homelands. We are committed to partnering with indigenous communities to raise awareness of their legacy and engage with the history of the region, the impacts of genocide, and the dynamics of settler colonialism that persist. Lincoln Park, where the Legion of Honor was founded in 1924, operated as city cemetery from 1868 until 1898. When the park was created, many of the burials were relocated, but the majority were not. Please join the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco in honoring the memory of the thousands of individuals still buried in this land. So, Dr. Lauricella is Curator of Prints and Drawings at the Achenbach Foundation for Graphic Arts and the organizer of two exhibitions currently on view at the Fine Arts Museums: Dress Rehearsal, a presentation of highlights from the Legion's foundational dance and theater collection, which you can see just down the hall this afternoon, and Matisse's Jazz Unbound, now on view at the De Young. A specialist in 19th century prints, Natalia completed her PhD in art history at the University of Southern California in 2021 and held a postdoctoral teaching fellowship at the Department of Art and Art History at Stanford University. Before embarking on her doctorate, Natalia worked as a curatorial assistant of collections and exhibitions at the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum in New York and contributed to a number of exhibitions there. Please join me in welcoming her to the podium.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Emily. It's wonderful to be here with you all today. Thank you so much for joining us this Saturday afternoon as we embark upon another deep dive into the collection of the Legion of Honor. My thanks to Emily Beanie for organizing this lecture series and for inviting me to participate. My thanks also to Maria and Rocio in public programs and to Michael and Rich and our colleagues in the theater for making this event possible today. I'm delighted to spend some time today exploring important developments in 19th century printmaking that had a tremendous impact on the history of visual culture and modern art. Color will be our central focus today, and we will trace the innovative ways that artists and printers explored color in printmaking, from color additions painstakingly applied by hand to a printed image, and then also to printing color through multiple plates. We will see how artists worked within and around the potentials and limitations of each print medium to incorporate color into their images, from the modern process of color lithography to the revivals of historical modes of printing such as etching and woodcut. The 19th century was one of dramatic technological change and constant artistic innovation, making 19th century prints one of the most dynamic fields of study and enduring areas of museum interest. Indeed, the range of experimentation in color printing in the 1800s is reflected in the collection of the Achenbach Foundation for Graphic Arts, the Works on Paper division of the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco. Donated to the city of San Francisco in 1948 by Moore and Hazel Achenbach, the collection has grown to be the largest and most comprehensive of the museums. It is also the largest works on paper collection, a classification that includes prints, drawings, photographs, and artists' books in the Western United States. I will be drawing on our holdings in the Achenbach to help tell the story of color printmaking in the 19th century. And some of the prints that I will discuss today will be featured in an upcoming exhibition I am organizing called Printing Color, Chiaroscuro to Screen Print. The show will be on view in the Achenbach Gallery at the Legion of Honor from May 24th through November 30th, and I hope you will come back to see it. Okay, let's look at some prints. I am going to start with some important historical context. Prior to the 19th century, printmaking was dominated by two printing techniques: relief printing in the form of the woodcut, and intaglio printing in the form of engraving, etching, and mezzotint, among other processes. In the history of prints, the earliest print technique was woodcut, which first appeared in China in the 9th century. Originally used for stamping designs onto fabrics and textiles, the woodcut was taken up by Western artists in the 14th century. To make a woodcut, an artist draws a composition on a block of wood and then uses chisels, knives, and gouges to cut away areas of the wood. When ink is applied to this carved surface and put through the press, the cut-away areas do not receive ink and remain white on the printed page. Every part of the block that is raised is inked, making it known as a relief print. This is an incredible woodcut by the artist Albrecht Dürer, and although it is a complex image, I think it helps us to see how a woodcut works. Any area of the print that you see that is white is in fact white because there is no ink. That is the paper. These are the areas that Dürer actually carved away on the woodblock. Everywhere that you see black ink, that is part of the block that remained, elevated above the carved sections so that it could receive ink. As you notice, most early modern woodcuts in the Western European context were monochromatic, meaning that they were printed in black ink on paper. I'm showing you here, however, an example of one of the earliest color prints that we have in the Achenbach from 1493. This is an illustration from the Nuremberg Chronicle, one of the most extensively illustrated books of the 15th century. Written by the Nuremberg physician and humanist Hartmann Schedel, the text is a history of the Christian world from the beginning of time to the early 1490s. The nearly 1,000 illustrations were made from woodblocks designed by a couple Nuremberg artists, including Michael Vulgemut. Some of the woodcut illustrations were printed in black ink and then hand-colored, like this one. Artisans would apply water-based pigments directly onto a printed image with black ink on paper, often using a brush to add color in a similar way to illuminated manuscripts. You can imagine this design as a sort of coloring book, with areas designated for specific colors to be filled in by hand. In some cases, stencils were used for faster repetition of color patterns. An exception to this practice of hand coloring a print was the chiaroscuro woodcut, first introduced in Italy around 1516. Chiaroscuro, its name coming from the Italian for light, chiaro, and shade, scuro, is a printmaking technique that uses contrast in tone to fabricate the illusion of depth. The process is an early form of color printing. Artists created hue and tone through multiple plates, in this case, several woodblocks inked in different colors. This example is after a painting by the artist Peter Paul Rubens, who understood the financial potential of publishing prints after his paintings. He began to collaborate with printer Christoffel Jäger in the early 1630s to create woodcut reproductions or interpretations of his paintings, including the rest on the flight into Egypt, which hangs in the Museo del Prado in Madrid. Outside of Europe, as some of you may have seen in our recent exhibition, Japanese Prints in Transition, woodblock prints flourished in Japan between the Edo period from 1603 to 1868 and the early Meiji era from 1868 to 1912. Woodblock prints were beautifully designed and carefully crafted, yet remained affordable and widely accessible. As Edo culture began to see a rising merchant class, elements of their leisure culture became the dominant subject matter of woodblock prints. Considered popular art in Japan, these delicately colored images of captivating subjects, including kabuki actors, landscapes, and courtesans of the pleasure quarters, helped establish a new category of art called ukiyo-e, or pictures of the floating world. The Achenbach has a very large collection of Japanese prints, and I'm showing you here 2 of our prints from the Edo period, in which you can see how many colors could be included in these dynamic images. Traditional Japanese prints, such as these, were made layer by layer, sometimes with dozens of blocks. Each block had to be printed in perfect alignment. This is something that we will discuss later in the context of chromolithography. The 2 artists here, Hokusai, who made the 36 views of Mount Fuji, and Utamaro, with his beautiful portraits of Japanese women, would go on to have a major influence on Western artists in the late 19th century, as we will soon see. Alongside woodcuts, the other major printmaking technique in the early modern period was intaglio printmaking, encompassing engraving and etching, processes that emerged around the 16th century or a bit earlier from metalwork. Intaglio comes from the Italian word intagliare, meaning to incise. In engraving, the engraver used a tool called a burin to cut lines into a polished metal plate. Unlike in relief printing, in engraving, the carved or incised lines actually hold the ink, transferred from the plate to the paper through the tremendous pressure of the printing press. I'm showing you here some wonderful examples by the 17th century printmaker Abraham Boss, who published the great treatise on intaglio printing. And these images are from a later edition published in 1758. We see the sharpening of the burin, the ways to hold and use a burin and to carve the plate, and the printing of an engraving. In terms of how an engraving looks, I'm showing you here an exquisite engraved print from around 1465, which is Justice from the E-series of tarot cards known as the Mantegna tarots. The Achenbach's impression has the addition of hand coloring in gold, which is extremely rare in the history of print. And on the right, with its large size and intricate design, Adam and Eve from 1504 is one of Albrecht Dürer's masterpieces of engraving. Notice how delicate the lines are compared with his own woodcut that I showed you earlier, so you can really see what engraving was able to do. Another intaglio process is etching. Etching, unlike in engraving, acid is used to bite or etch an image onto the printed plate, the metal plate. The metal plate is covered with an acid-resistant material called a hard ground, and this is the image on the far left, though our techniques have changed. The artist uses a stylus to then draw an image onto the surface, cutting into the hard ground. You see the stylus next and the hand that is drawing with it in these images. The plate is then dropped into an acid bath. This man is actually holding an acid bath, which we would definitely not do today, where the acid bites the lines not protected by the hard ground. Then the plate is inked up and printed. Here are two of the most famous artists to work in etching, Rembrandt and Francisco Goya. Indeed, etching is the print technique that artists since the Renaissance have most favored, in large part because of the ease with which they could render a composition. And you can see here with the etchings I'm showing you, the lines can be delicate, they can be precise and smooth, and the addition of a technique called aquatint can add tonal range, as you can see in the gray background of the Goya. And it's particularly evident if you look at the figure's coat where there are areas of aquatint and areas without. Like early woodcuts, most engravings and etchings were monochrome, as printing color would have been very difficult. And indeed, most print collectors up until the late 19th century really preferred monochrome prints. The addition of color would not have really appealed to them at all. There are certainly exceptions that included hand coloring. This example is a wonderful print from the late 18th century that captures the enthusiasm for the ancient sites of Herculaneum and Pompeii, excavated in the 1700s after having been buried when Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 CE. Two artists, Francesco Piranesi and Louis-Jean Després, collaborated to create images that could serve as a souvenir of a visit to Pompeii. Desprez made observations at the site of the ruins. Piranesi then etched the prints, which were in turn hand-colored with watercolors by Desprez. The extraordinary prints were then signed and marketed as dessins coloriés, or colored drawings. It was not until the 18th century that printers began to develop new techniques to actually print color through intaglio processes, including mezzotint. The key to the process of mezzotint was the special serrated tool called a rocker that was used to systematically roughen the copper plate, creating a surface that, if inked, would print uniformly black. The artist would then scrape the design using various burnishing tools, flattening the raised burrs left by the rocker to produce highlights. Mezzotint creates soft and richly contrasting tones, which I think are quite visible in the works that I'm showing you here. To print color mezzotints, some printers added multiple color inks to the same metal plate through a technique called à la poupée. The poupée, or doll, refers to a little cloth ball that looked like a doll, used to apply ink precisely to specific areas of the plate's surface. In the 1720s, Jacob Christoffel Le Bon created a process of printing mezzotints from multiple color plates. Le Bon drew from Sir Isaac Newton's theory of color, printing red, yellow, and blue mezzotint plates to produce an image with a full range of color, essentially the basis for today's familiar CYMK printing, the process that uses cyan, magenta, yellow, and black inks to create printed images. I'm showing you here a few examples of prints that combine etching with color mezzotint. It might be a bit hard to see in the color mezzotints, but there is a rich and velvety texture that is achieved through this process. On the right is a print by Philibert Louis de Beaucourt, who based this print on an earlier painting, Feigned Caress, which he exhibited at the Paris Salon of 1785. The print represents an 18th century French trope of a woman in two contrasting roles, as a flirtatious coquette or as a pure wife and mother. We see an elderly husband enjoying his portrait of himself kissing his beautiful young wife. Meanwhile, she accepts a kiss behind his back from the handsome artist. The other print is by Claude Lorrain, a reproduction from his Liber Veritatis, or Book of Truth. The artist made highly finished copy drawings of nearly all of his paintings in a bound sketchbook to discourage forgery of his work. Mezzotint was used to reproduce the drawings, and mezzotint, in fact, was often used to reproduce fine art because it could really capture the colors and textures of paintings and drawings especially. In general, because of the mezzotint plate's fragility and the complexity and expense of printing, mezzotints were never produced in large numbers. This is the major difference between mezzotint and lithography, the medium that would truly transform the history of color printmaking. So what is lithography? Lithography was invented by Alois Sennefelder in Germany in 1796 as he experimented with ways to reproduce sheet music. Lithography soon became a popular printmaking process, quickly appealing to printers in Europe because of its ease, efficiency, and durability. As a planographic process, the medium does not require the laborious work of carving wood or engraving metal, characteristics of the early modern print methods of woodcut and engraving. Based on the principle that water and oil resist one another, lithography is a chemical process involving a thick limestone block onto which an image is drawn directly with an oil crayon. Here we have two examples of lithographic stones with images still on their surfaces from the 19th century. On the left, the stone had on its surface a wrapper for cheese that would have printed in multiple colors. On the right, a hand-drawn advertisement for shoes. You can see how the images sort of rest on top of the stone's surface, which is porous. Then the printer would use an ink roller to apply a greasy ink to the stone surface. The stone would be placed in a press bed, paper laid carefully atop it, and then the stone would pass through the press so that the image transferred onto paper. The first adopters of lithography in France established ateliers in Paris in the 1810s. In its nascent years, lithographic production remained small-scale and experimental, competing with relief and intaglio printmaking. The simplicity and ease of lithography immediately intrigued salon painters in the early 19th century. Rather than carving or etching a surface, artists could draw freely and easily on the stone surface, almost as if they were drawing on a piece of paper, except in reverse, always. Visiting the small lithographic print shops in Paris, most notably that of Godefroy Engelmann, who will come up again later, salon painters such as Théodore Géricault, Antoine Gros, and Carl and Horace Vernet experimented in monochrome lithography, exhibiting their lithographs at the Salon as early as 1817. Some artists, such as Anne-Louis Giraudet, reproduced their own paintings through lithography, whereas other artists, such as Géricault and Eugène Delacroix, considered lithography to be an experimental form of drawing and used the medium to produce original compositions. Outside of the Salon and academic artistic circles, lithography also immediately appealed to printers and publishers because of its potential for generating large edition sizes. Since the image was inscribed on the stone's surface, as long as the stone was continuously re-inked between printings, the surface would not degrade or break, as was common in woodcut, engraving, and etching, and this was a huge game changer. A lithographic stone could thus produce seemingly endless impressions. Lithography was therefore widely employed to reproduce documents and images quickly and efficiently, making the medium a popular choice for printing illustrations in journals and books. Additionally, lithography's association with spontaneity made it a particularly suitable medium for political satire and caricature. It was the preferred printmaking process for satirical artists Honoré Daumier and Paul Gavarni in the 1830s and 40s. Lithographs circulated in books as illustration, in journals in the form of caricatures like these ones I'm showing you by Daumier. On the left, Daumier takes up one of his favorite topics, the public visiting the salon, where a bourgeois visitor mistakes the painting he's looking at while referring to his booklet, thinking it is a portrait of a gentleman while it is quite obviously a painting of a bull. The caricature on the right pokes fun at two men trying and obviously failing to hunt in a snowstorm. As we can see, the majority of lithographs printed in the first decades of the 19th century were monochrome. Color printing was in fact possible from the medium's invention, but because lithography was primarily employed for quick and cheap reproduction, the addition of color would have overly complicated the process and rendered it significantly more expensive. Any lithographs with color from this period were produced through hand coloring. Hand-colored lithographs continued the long tradition of hand coloring in the history of print that we've just surveyed. Lithographers printed images that could either be left black and white or colored by hand. The application of color was either divided by color among assistants, or if quality was of particular concern, one person would apply all of the colors. For larger edition sizes, printers might use stencils to expedite the process, though this technique sometimes made the quality noticeably poorer. In general, hand coloring was typically quite inconsistent, and such applications became less practical the larger the edition size. The practice of hand coloring remained in use for several decades, however, until the mechanization of printing rendered the process too inefficient. I'm showing you here two examples of hand-colored lithographs. On the left, we have a hand-colored litho after the great French painter Louis-Léopold Boilly, who was known for his portraits. The name of the painter is written on the stone, but you can see on the left-hand side the name of the printer, François Séraphin Delpech, who was a renowned lithographer in the 1820s. Here we have a young woman who is declining the advances of an older gentleman, while an older woman looks on with an expression of judgment. This is from the series Recueil de Profils et Grimaces, a collection of 98 separately published original lithographs by Delpech after Boilly's compositions, which make fun of various members of French society. And on the right is a work by Frédéric Bouchot, an illustrator and caricaturist who was a contemporary of Daumier. This is plate 2 of 27 on the subject of the French National Guard, military, gendarmerie, and police reserve force, founded in 1789 during the French Revolution. We also have on view right now a few really lovely examples of hand-colored lithographs in our exhibition, Dress Rehearsal, The Art of Theatrical Design. And this is in Gallery 22 and the Logan Gallery, so you can see these after. Two elegant portraits of ballerinas, Marie Taglioni and Fanny Sarito, are printed in monochrome lithography with the beautiful color additions in watercolor. And the third is a very nice hand-colored lithograph printed at Le Mercier, the famous print shop in Paris, that depicts a behind-the-scenes moment at the ballet. This one is in Logan. Though prints were inexpensive, especially compared with unique paintings, you can still imagine how these would have felt like precious objects to their owners, and I really hope you have a chance to see these after the lecture. So when did printers start actually printing in color or making chromolithographs? The successful development of chromolithography required material and technological advancements, including the production of color inks and streamlined processes for color separation and registration. Drawing on the 18th century practice of color intaglio printing, early lithographers experimented with techniques for printing multiple colors, either through the application of multiple colors onto one stone or through the separation of an image onto multiple stones. Printers eventually developed this last technique of multiple stone printing for chromolithography. The process required a consistent method for color registration, aligning the various colors on the printed paper. They finally achieved that consistency in 1837 with the development of French lithographer Godefroy Engelmann's frame, which made color registration much easier. And it was Engelmann, in fact, who called this form of printing chromolithography. The process, however, remained labor-intensive and expensive, so publishers typically reserved it for the luxury books and reproductions of fine art. I'm showing you two examples here of reproductions of fine art from the 1860s. These are chromolithographs published by the Arundel Society, founded in London in 1849, and named for the Earl of Arundel, the collector of the Arundel marbles, now at the Ashmolean Museum, and one of the first great English patrons of the arts. The group's ambition was to promote knowledge of the artworks of the old masters, and they did this through publishing chromolithographs after Italian artworks, such as these, which were drawn and printed by Christian Schultz, one of the professional copyists employed by the society. We also have an example from closer to home with this 1860 chromolithographic advertisement for the Overland Mail Company, headquartered in Salt Lake City. The company brought mail and passengers across the country to San Francisco, so it is appropriate that this chromolithograph, with the addition of hand coloring, was printed by Britton and Ray of San Francisco, the leading print and lithograph makers in California at the time. Mechanization in the 1860s and 1870s made chromolithographs such as these faster and cheaper to produce. In terms of how they were made, printing in chromolithography involved copying different parts of an image onto different stones, inking each stone in a different color, and then layering each color on paper by pulling one stone after another through the press. The process of printing in color lithography was particularly exciting because of the effects of layering color on paper. Here we have a great advertisement from the 1890s that demonstrates how the layering of colors via separate stones would have looked in a step-by-step visual explanation. As you can see before you, this was a very complex process, requiring printers with tremendous skill and knowledge of color. How do you prepare separate stones for each color? How would color look printed next to another color? How would colors layer on the paper to create new tones? Specially trained printers emerged to work on chromolithographs. The development of steam presses in the second half of the 19th century then enabled the large-scale printing of color lithographs, these were chromolithographs commonly referred to as chromos. Chromos became widespread in the commercial sphere, advertising consumer goods and entertainment culture, illustrating journals and magazines, and covering the walls of fast-growing cities such as Paris. They were often printed on cheap ephemeral paper via large steam presses in industrial settings. Chromos typically consisted of numerous and bright colors, sometimes up to 20 colors for a single image. They circulated everywhere, and some thought that they oversaturated the market. Indeed, by the end of the 19th century, chromos soon became the subject of harsh criticism by art and cultural critics who saw them as cheap, garish, and crude. A notable exception were the posters of the artist and trained lithographer Jules Chéret, whose work was seen as exciting and modern, but also understood to be elegant and tasteful. From the 1870s, he popularized chromolithography in the public as well as in the fine art world. In fact, his style of poster remains synonymous with the period called the Belle Époque because of his now iconic depictions of female figures known as chèrettes in advertisements for entertainment venues, including music halls, circuses, operas, café-concerts, and balls. One of Chéret's posters here is for a liquor company. We see a woman seated in an unidentifiable place. She might be in a cafe, a restaurant, her own living room. This is quite typical of Chéret to create a very ambiguous setting. She could really be anywhere, toasting to her guests, her companion, a performer, and maybe the cat on her lap. The other is a poster featuring the performer Loie Fuller. A close friend of the Legion of Honor co-founder Alma de Bretteville-Spreckels, American dancer Loie Fuller arrived in Paris in the early 1890s to great critical acclaim. Fuller dressed in voluminous swaths of silk that billowed and undulated while she danced on stage, while multicolored lights from many directions were projected onto her. Immediately embraced by the avant-garde artistic circles of the Parisian fin de siècle, her work was represented by numerous artists in painting, printmaking, sculpture, and the early films of the Lumière brothers. Here, Chéret uses green, yellow, and pink to capture her colorful, dynamic performance. His chromolithographs indeed captured the vibrant visual culture of this period, and in the fin de siècle, his colorful posters, blanketing the streets of Paris, inspired many avant-garde artists to work in the medium, contributing to what became known as the color revolution in the graphic arts. Most of the artists that Chéret inspired were not professional printers as he was, but painters, many of whom experimented with color in their artistic practice, exploring its symbolic, psychological, and scientific potential. In the final decades of the 19th century, these artists largely rejected France's traditional salon system and the training that accompanied this program. There, the instructors' and jurors' taste was typically conservative and traditional, and they favored large-scale paintings with historical, religious, or classical motifs. In contrast, avant-garde artists sought new styles and new formats, as well as new venues to sell and display their artistic work, and they abandoned the emphasis on naturalism and mimesis, or copying, taught in fine arts schools such as the École des Beaux-Arts, to experiment more freely with color, line, and form. Many avant-garde painters of the late 19th century took up printmaking, and color lithography in particular, as another medium through which to explore color. Following on the heels of the Impressionists who attempted to convey the optical effects of light and color directly through paint, Georges Seurat, Paul Signac, and their cohort developed divisionism, a technique that explored juxtapositions of pure color that would mix in the viewer's eye rather than on the canvas. Indeed, Signac, whose beautiful color lithograph I'm showing you here, recognized that the medium of color lithography offered a unique opportunity to test his color theory through the breakdown of color that occurred in the printmaking process. Because lithography involved the layering of individual colors on paper from separately inked stones, the printing process suited Signac's chromatic experimentation. Untrained in the complexities of lithography, however, he worked closely with the master printer Auguste Clos, who assisted and guided him in the materialization of his theory in print. I mentioned earlier that chromolithography required the great technical skill of printers, and for many of the avant-garde artists making color lithographs in the 1890s, Auguste Clos was the printer with whom they chose to work because of his understanding of color in particular. Here we have a portrait of Clos, as well as a really fun sketch depicting him at work, you see at the bottom there, in the journal of the artist Pierre Bonnard. And as an aside, Clos was the main topic of my doctoral dissertation, so I am particularly interested in his role in the production of color lithographs, so he'll kind of be peppered in throughout the rest of the lecture. Clos worked with many artists of this period, including the symbolist Odilon Redon. This print represents Redon's fullest experimentation with color lithography. Revisiting the subject of a pastel from about a decade earlier, Béatrice portrays a recurring figure in Redon's work, the woman who inspired the Italian poet Dante Alighieri. This color lithograph features an ethereal, almost ghostly figure, her long neck and bare shoulders floating against a muted sky. The sole splash of color appears in the upper right corner, where vibrant blue organic shapes emerge as if from outside the frame. Perhaps a decorative addition, the markings seem to be leaves from a nearby tree hovering above the figure at center. Redon's Béatrice materializes out of swaths of color, the contours of the figure's pale yellow face outlined only by the gray sky against which she stands. It was Clos who himself prepared the stones and color inks, beautifully translating Redon's pastels into printing ink on paper. Redon was one of many artists producing color lithographs with Clos that were commissioned by publishers and appeared as limited edition lithographs in albums of prints in the 1890s. These avant-garde prints were often made with fewer and more muted colors, in part to distinguish them from the chromos still in the public sphere. Color lithography also appealed to young artists because of its lucrative and democratic nature. Through color lithography, artists could display their art in more visible settings, such as entertainment and advertising posters. They could create multiple copies of original designs, and they could circulate their artistic ideas to a wider audience. The graphic arts also served as a means to publicize their names and strengthen their reputations in a newly emerging art market outside of the formal structures of the salon. Encouraged in large part by art dealers and publishers such as Ambroise Vollard and André Marty, who saw this as an exciting new territory in the art market, these artists found alternative venues and a novel medium for expression in color lithography. It was Vollard who published the two albums from which these prints come, Pierre Bonnard's Quelques aspects de la vie de Paris, or Some Scenes of Parisian Life, and Edouard Vuillard's Paysages et Intérieurs, or Landscapes and Interiors. Each print album, or suite, consists of about a dozen color lithographs, expertly printed by Clos on thick, fine paper. Vuillard and Bonnard were part of a group of artists called the Nabi. The Nabi is Hebrew for prophets, and they explored the symbolic potential of color and felt that art could not simply be a visual sensation recorded or copied exactly. Unconstrained by the need to portray scenes naturalistically, they explored color using muted soft tones as part of a new visual language for communicating interior states. The Nabi were considered intimists, meaning that they explored what Bonnard called daily spectacles and modest acts of life. These prints by Vuillard and Bonnard exemplify the spirit and aims of the Nabi. Their world was an intimate one, consisting of corners of the studio, a cozy cafe, the living room, the familiar scene from a window, and portraits of family and close friends. This is another lithograph from Vuillard's album, and one of my favorites. Vuillard's lithograph represents the dramatist Tristan Bernard on the left and an unidentified figure hunched over a checkerboard in a warm-toned interior decorated with floral wallpaper. The setting is likely the apartment of Vuillard's patron, Thaddée Natanson, on the Rue Saint-Florentin, and the scene is presided over by Natanson's wife, Missia, a leading light of the fin de siècle art world, who was the object of Vuillard's unrequited love. In a style characteristic of Vuillard, the interior scene is built up through layers of overlapping color, each printed from a separately inked stone. The Nabi were so intimately involved in color lithography in the 1890s that Bonnard even illustrated the cover of the preeminent text on this topic, André Malherio's La lithographie originale en couleur, from 1898. Malheriot was an important art critic of the period, and his book took stock of the importance of original color printing in this period, naming many of the most important printers, publishers, and artists of the moment. I love this cover because we can see here the process of color printing beneath the book's title. A lithographic stone sits on the press, a bowl of water and a sponge nearby, because remember the stone needed to be kept damp. A woman stands at the center. You can see her behind the G as she examines a print just pulled from the press. It's as if she is examining the print that we ourselves are looking at, and in theory we could be holding if we were holding the book. At the Achenbach, we have 3 proof impressions that show us how the image was printed. This is a print made using 3 stones and 3 colors, each separated here for us to see. The leftmost proof would have been for the blue ink, the center for the kind of orangey yellow ink, and the right for the black ink. The image was drawn onto the stones always in black crayon, and only when a stone is inked up with a specific color is color ever actually involved. So you can imagine how hard this would have been for an artist to visualize and comprehend, and hence the importance of someone like Clos working with them in this process. The final print on the far left would have been made when each stone printed its image onto the paper one after another. And we have these prints in black ink, which might be confusing, because sometimes a process was started by printing each section of the print in black ink so that artists could see what the composition looked like before color was mixed and finalized. So who was in Mallario's book? Certainly Bonnard and the Nabi. Another great printmaker of this period, and one artist certainly mentioned in Mallario's book, was Henri Rivière. Like the Nabi, he was an artist who often worked in series and was an artist who was deeply inspired by the city in which he lived, Paris. Here we have 2 plates from Rivière's 36 views of the Eiffel Tower, printed and published in 1902 by the lithographer Eugène Vergnaud, who was another important printer of this period. In direct response to Hokusai's 36 views of Mount Fuji, from which we saw the Great Wave earlier in the lecture, Rivière followed the construction of the Eiffel Tower, which was built in 1889 for the Paris Universal Exposition. Soaring high above any other structure yet built, it symbolized modern technology and the powerful new age of iron. Based on drawings he made during the monument's construction between 1887 and 1892, the artist's 36 lithographs explore the dominance of the structure over the city's skyline. On the right, the only nocturne in Rivière's series recalls similar nighttime scenes in Japanese prints depicting firework displays. The annual firework celebrations of July 14th on the Seine near the Eiffel Tower originated in 1889 on the 100th anniversary of the storming of the Bastille. Rivière's view shows boaters mesmerized by the light beams projecting from the top of the tower. In a more humble light display in the foreground, Japanese paper lanterns are suspended above the water on cables made invisible by the darkness. The influence of Japanese print on his work is evident, especially in the flatness of the composition, and I'm going to speak more about this in a moment. Okay, so the artist that Malario singled out above all the rest as the most innovative in color lithography was Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, whose prints and posters many of you may recognize. Born into an aristocratic family, Lautrec had left his family's chateau in southern France to become an artist. As a student, he was drawn to the nightlife that was just developing in Montmartre, the area where Sacré-Cœur was being built. In the nightclubs, cabarets, and brothels of that part of Paris, he found the subjects of his deep obsession and of his art, including the clowness Xiao Cao and the dancer Marcel Lender. An artist who moved fluidly between painting, drawing, and printmaking, Lautrec is in many ways most well known for his prints, particularly because he was so prolific and so experimental in color lithography, and these, I feel, are some of his most striking color lithographs. Working outside of any artistic group, Lautrec's prints stand alone in his dramatic cropping and flattening of space, and in his radical simplification of form. The addition of pattern on the wallpaper, Lender's clothing, and the carpet beneath Xiao Cao's feet creates texture and dimension in the scenes. His prints and posters often feel playful and spontaneous, as if drawn on a whim, with little planning and a lot of energy. And that's indeed how he worked in lithography, often directly on the stone, spending much of his day in the lithography atelier right alongside the printers. It was Clos, in fact, who printed the clowness, and Lautrec's other favorite print shop was the one that produced the Marcel Lender, Edouard Ancourt, where he worked with Henri Stern, one of his close drinking buddies and friends and printer. In Montmartre, Lautrec also found patrons, the owners of and performers in various nightclub establishments who asked him to design promotional posters for their businesses. In the early 1890s, he began making posters, quickly gaining commercial fame. His graphic posters embody the ebullient, frenetic spirit of the nightlife of fin de siècle Paris. His posters typically had bold yet simple images that would be easily recognizable from afar. Toulouse-Lautrec's poster for the Divan Japonais, one of the numerous nightclubs in Montmartre, stands out for its unusual conception and composition. Unlike earlier representations of dance or cabaret performances by artists such as Degas and Seurat, the emphasis here is not on the performers, but on the spectators. The poster shows a beautiful redhead, this is the dancer Jeanne Avril, wearing a tight-fitting black coat and an enormous black hat with an ostrich feather. Behind her sits her companion, a middle-aged gentleman sporting a cane and a monocle. He leans over as if to whisper something to her, but she, of course, is completely focused on the stage, where a headless female performer with long black gloves sings, accompanied by a small pit orchestra. The performer, we know, is Yvette Gilbert, recognizable by her signature black gloves. The waving hands of the conductor and the necks of the double basses form a strange kind of ghost-like backdrop to the main figures. The poster derives its power both from its startling composition and from this radical simplification of form I mentioned. The streamlined black silhouette of the woman's slender figure immediately attracts our eyes and draws us into the space in which she and her companion are perched. Only later do we finally recognize their surroundings and the poster's text, which we see is providing the name of the cabaret, the address, the director. It makes sense then that the many poster artists were inspired by Japanese woodblock prints, whose simple flowing contours, bright flat colors uniform in hue and shade, and unusual compositions seemed the perfect models. Many artists, like Lautrec, were inspired by Cheret in the late 19th century, but the other major impact on color printing was the introduction of Japanese prints into Europe, such as the examples that I showed you earlier by Hokusai and Utamaro. Japanese curios, or objets d'art, circulated around Paris following the Japanese opening to the West in 1854, and the 1867 Exposition Universelle introduced the public to Japanese ceramics, metalwork, and prints. It was not until the 1870s that the market for Japanese arts and crafts began to flourish, encouraged in part by the dealer Siegfried Bing. Bing held an exhibition on Japanese prints in 1890 at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris that proved incredibly significant for fostering interest in ukiyo-e prints. Marking the culmination of the popularity of Japanese prints in France, the exhibition was advertised by a color lithographic poster by Jules Cheret, which really goes to show the wide influence of Japanese prints on the graphic arts in France and on color lithography. In the show, Bing presented the history of Japanese prints from roughly 1600 to 1860, and viewers had the opportunity to see hundreds and hundreds of ukiyo-e prints. Japanese prints in the 1890 exhibition would have a tremendous influence on the work of many artists working in other printing media as well, including the American Impressionist artist Mary Cassatt, as I hope many of you got to see in our recent exhibition, Mary Cassatt at Work. She was an innovative printmaker, particularly in the realm of color etching in the late 19th century. At the 1890 exhibition, she became fascinated by the scenes of quotidian life captured in vibrant colors in Japanese woodblocks. She was already experimenting in intaglio processes, and she strove to mimic the intricate patterns and layered color of Japanese woodblocks in this Western printmaking form. In 1890-91, Cassatt produced a series of color prints now known as the Set of 10. Deeply inspired by both aesthetics and subjects of Japanese prints, Cassatt's suite of color etchings explore the everyday life of Parisian women as they prepare for the day at their toilettes, ride the omnibus, and attend a dress fitting, have tea with a friend, and care for their children. In the Achenbach, we have one from the set of 10 and two more joining the collection as promised gifts, and it's the three that I'm showing you here. These were all on view in Mary Cassatt at Work, so I hope you did have a chance to see them in person. In her home studio, Cassatt worked tirelessly in collaboration with printer Modeste Leroy to develop and refine a complex method to print color, combining dry point etching and aquatint to print colors from multiple plates. In fact, you might be able to see that in the two prints on the left, she included the printer's name alongside her own, and I love this recognition of his important collaboration. This acknowledgement was almost never the case for Clos. The prints contain a number of Japanese-inspired devices, among them unusual viewpoints, flat areas of color, strong diagonals, flattening of forms, and emphasis on pattern and line. Cassatt's palette was inspired by Japanese prints as well. In Women Bathing, you can see the dusty blue, pink, umber, and green tones that are identical to the subdued color schemes in the 18th century prints of Utamaro, one of Cassatt's most important influences. This print, along with Maternal Caress and Mother's Kiss, illustrate the technically innovative ways in which Cassatt and Leroy printed in color, whether capturing color through layers, large areas of aquatint on the plate, or carefully applying multiple colors to a single plate to print color à la poupée, which is the technique I mentioned earlier, developed in the context of 18th century mezzotint printing. Cassatt's prints had an impact on her fellow Impressionists, particularly those involved in printmaking and the 19th century so-called etching revival. After seeing Cassatt's color prints, and with Cassatt's strong encouragement, the Impressionist Camille Pissarro purchased a press in 1894 in order to begin experimenting with color printing, making this print soon after in 1894-95. Pissarro found that the deconstruction of color required in printing was productive to his thinking about color as an Impressionist. But he also strove to print color in a different way than Cassatt, and I think you can see the difference in their styles. She preferred the flat and even swaths of color, while Pissarro was interested in the blending of colors through the layering of ink from one plate after another plate. The result in this luxurious field of color that has a very rich texture. This print will be on view in the Printing Color exhibition, and I highly recommend coming back to see it because it's really beautiful in person. So I want to finish my lecture today where I began, with woodcuts. We've now spent some time talking about this so-called color revolution in the graphic arts in relation to the amazing works in color lithography and color etching that we have in the collection. But Bing's Japanese print show had also a major impact on the revival of woodcut in the fin de siècle. Here I am showing you Auguste Leper's color woodcut, the convalescent Madame Lepère from 1892. Lepère was one of the most inventive, skilled, and prolific printmakers in late 19th century France. Along with Henri Rivière, whose work in lithography we saw earlier, Lepère advocated for the revival of artistic woodcuts in France in the late 19th century. This rare woodcut is considered the artist's masterpiece. Inspired by Japanese techniques and materials, the artist used water-based inks for this print, resulting in overall soft tones. It was printed in a very small edition, and the artist inked the blocks with different colors for each impression, making each print unique. In the bold frontal quality of the portrait, Lepère was clearly influenced by Japanese ukiyo-e woodblock prints of actors, which were popular in Parisian artistic circles of the period, and this one will also be in printing color. Another color woodcut in the collection is by the well-known Norwegian artist Edvard Munch. During a stay in Paris in 1896, Munch was introduced to woodcut printing, having previously worked in etching and lithography. Attracted to the experimental quality of the medium, he quickly incorporated it into his artistic repertoire, including the wood's rich grain patterns into his printed images, as you can see here. In this print, the stiffness of the subject's pose contrasts with the expressive energy of Munch's handling of the woodcut medium. Additionally, by leaving the woman's face devoid of color, Munch draws our attention instead to the background in a print that would have otherwise been seen as a portrait. This is an artistic choice that aligns with Munch's interest in using art to illustrate a more universal human experience. And I love how much you can really see the wood, the material of the wood here. The experiments in color printing of the late 19th century that we've surveyed, including the developments of new technologies such as color lithography and the revival of older processes such as etching and woodcut, had an important impact on modern art and the art market in the 20th century. As we saw, many artists who were primarily painters were inspired to extend their explorations of color and form into print on paper. As new reproductive technologies emerged, such as the photogravure, the halftone, and later the autochrome, making processes such as lithography less common in the commercial sphere, artists continued to find in printmaking an exciting platform for their original artistic production. Printmaking, though complex and process-heavy, inspired them to push their artwork to new levels as they worked within and through the limitations of each medium, often guided by and in close collaboration with professional printers. Color printmaking continued to attract artists throughout the 20th century, and today renowned Bay Area presses such as Crown Point Press and Paulson Fontaine Press keep this practice very much alive by producing dynamic color prints in collaboration with contemporary artists. All this and more will soon be illustrated in the exhibition Printing Color, Chiaroscuro to Screen Print, and I hope you will have the chance to come back and see this later in the spring. In the meantime, you can see Matisse's Jazz Unbound at the Diang, which presents probably the most important artist book or livre d'artiste of the 20th century, Jazz by Matisse, published in 1947. The book consists of 20 plates that are vibrantly printed using a process called pochoir, a traditional French handcraft stenciling technique. This book is quite literally about color, and I hope you'll enjoy having the chance to see these stunning prints in person, and that you'll remember the long history of color printmaking that came before. Thank you. We have time, Maria, for one or two questions. Anyone have any questions? We have a question over here. Maria, I don't know if... Oh, we have one over there.
Thank you very much for the lecture. During the early part, you made the statement that collectors would not have been interested in prints of color. Can you tell us more about that?
The question, I knew this would come up. The question was why print collectors were not interested in color prints that I mentioned briefly when I was contextualizing woodcuts and etchings and engravings. So this is a really interesting, as you may have recognized, my deep area of research is 1890s color lithography, and there's so much written in that period about how traditional print collectors really were not interested in color prints. For a long time, probably because you couldn't actually print color, collectors were much more interested in the ways in which printers could convey color in other ways. They loved the way that engravers could kind of capture form and tone through what's kind of famously known as the parallel lines of engraving, let's say. So, an area that is supposed to be darker or lighter would be conveyed through deeper, closer together lines in an engraving versus kind of thinner and farther apart lines. So they really felt like you didn't need color, that so much of this could be achieved through the techniques of printmaking. So it was partly just the historical tradition that didn't really have printed color until the late 19th century, and in that period, at that point, they just felt like it was kind of a cheap go-around, if that makes sense, to print color. Thank you. I think we had a question over here.
Yeah, in the color printmaking, is the color or the black and white outlines usually laid down first?
Well, that's a good question. Oftentimes, the darkest color is at the end, I believe, right, Cynthia? We have our favorite conservator here who I work with very closely to look at the order in which things are printed. But typically it's, for color lithography, what they would do is they would have what's called the mother stone, or the kind of main stone, which has the whole composition, no color, just everything in black. And then from there, you transfer different parts of the images onto different stones to break down. That's called the color separation I was talking about. And then from there, you would, it kind of depends how you'd want to print what order, but you typically print lighter and then get darker at the end. But that's something that these artists worked very closely with the professional printers who they collaborated with, who knew a lot better, how that would look versus an artist who, is new to lithography, who might ask the printer, why don't you decide on the order of coloring, of, the printing. But it really depended. Thank you so much. I think that's it, Maria. Okay, thank you.